Hi, everybody. This is David Weber, and this is Lecture 2 for Essentials of Organization. Essentials of Organization is a module that is being delivered in Period 4, the fourth period of the school year, second period of the spring semester, 2020. And this lecture, we're going to look at organizational structure. Now, just as we did in Lecture 1, I am going to open up the PowerPoint slides and play them on my laptop as I record this lecture. So when I send you the slide deck via email and I make this audio-visual recording available to you, you can put the two together and follow along with what I'm saying by using the slide deck. So let's get right down to business. I'll tell you the title of the slides so you can keep track like that. So what we're going to be talking about today is, as I said, organizational structure. Another word we're going to be using today is organizational design. And as both of those terms may suggest, organizations are assembled, constructed. They are usually more or less intentionally created and planned and designed in order to achieve the organizational purpose, act in line with the organizational mission and vision, and adhere to the organization's values. So how an organization goes about sort of making a plan, making a design, creating a way of making all of that happen, that's what we call organizational structure or organizational design. The words are often used somewhat interchangeably. So let's talk about a couple of big picture ideas first. Let's go to the slide that says environment. Once you have a bunch of people who agree on an organizational purpose, mission, vision, and core values, once you have people who are kind of coalescing around that set of ideas and commitments, and let's say it's 2 people, 3 people, 6 people who are starting an organization, what you are then asking yourself is, well, what's the environment that we are going to create this organization in, that we're going to design this organization within? So the organizational environment is a kind of a big picture concept here. And if you look at the slide titled The Environment, you'll see a kind of grid with a light-colored arrow shooting through it. That's to represent kind of the three-dimensionality of an organizational environment. So if you take the concept of stable and dynamic, stable meaning doesn't change that much, dynamic meaning changing all the time, and you make an X and Y axis with that and simple and complex, simple meaning very few parts, very simple to understand what each part is all about. Complex meaning many, many parts, and some number of those parts happen to be pretty difficult to understand. If you make an XY axis with those two, stability and dynamism, stable and dynamic, and simple and complex, that's most of the organizational environment. But there's a third vector that kind of describes the organizational environment, and that's shown by that lighter colored arrow going through the middle of that first X and Y axis I described. And that third arrow is abundant and scarce, and this refers to the resources available to members of an organization. You can have many, many resources, that's abundance. You can have very few resources, that's scarcity. And think about the days that we're living in now with coronavirus and the pandemic and quarantine and so forth. Think about how that has reduced the number of resources available to an organization. Fewer customers buying things, that means less money coming into an organization. Well, that suddenly shifts the environment, and that's going to possibly shift the design or the redesign of any number of organizations. Stable and dynamic. Well, up until February or March, many organizations experienced the pool they swam in, they experienced kind of the world in which they existed as relatively stable. I mean, we live in an era of lots of change, but that becomes, that kind of sort of expected change, in a sense, becomes stability. Well, the coronavirus pandemic threw a great deal of that out the window, and we're in an environment that is not characterized by stability, at least not right now. Maybe in a few months that will come to pass. But right now we're in an environment that's characterized by relative scarcity of certain resources, relative dynamism or instability, and simple versus complex. Well, so much of this coronavirus pandemic, so much of it is very complex, both in terms of trying to understand it and complex in understanding how it's affecting us. So suddenly, in the space of maybe only 2 months, the environment within a multitude of organizations attempted to operate has changed tremendously. So that's going to affect the organizational structure or the organizational design. Now, the second thing to think about, big picture with respect to design of organizations, is what in the next slide is titled Approaches to Organizational Design. And you can have two basic types of organizational designs. You can have a mechanistic design, which is fairly linear, fairly simple. It consists of relationships that are relatively easy to understand. This is the classic organizational design, and it's illustrated by that that chart there that you've seen 100 times. Of one person at the top of the pyramid with, in this case, 4 people or groups below him or her, and each of those 4 has 4 or 3 or 4 people or groups reporting to that middle layer. We talked about this last week when we talked about chain of command and bureaucracy. These are all mechanistic designs. And then on the other hand, you have organic designs. And, you know, in American English, we would say one size does not fit all. Not every organization needs to be or should be structured in a mechanistic way. Some organizations are so distinctive, maybe even unique in what they offer and how they see themselves, that they have to generate their own organic designs, their own unique designs that are organic to, naturally occurring from, naturally emerging from these activities that members engage in. So the next slide is called organizational structure, and it lists the 7 key elements of an organization's structure. I'll read them off, and then we'll talk about them one by one. Go to the next slide for this, the 7 key elements. So there's work specialization, departmentalization, chain of command, span of control, centralization and decentralization, formalization, and boundary spanning. So let's kind of go back and look into those in some more detail. So work specialization, that just means the degree to which the activities people in a particular role or set of roles, the particular activities that they do. As a lecturer, I have some work specialization that is not identical to the work specialization done by other employees of the Han who are designated researchers as opposed to lecturers. The researchers may teach, 1 or 2 modules, but they spend most of their time engaging in academic research. I, on the other hand, as a lecturer, I teach 4 or 5 modules, and although I happen to do some academic research, it's not my primary area of specialization in my work at the Han, and nor is it my primary work specialization at the University of North Carolina, where I teach. I have to teach and I have to do some research, but my number one specialization area is teaching, and that's true of many of my colleagues. Departmentalization. Well, when you get a whole bunch of people doing the same kind of jobs, the same kind of specializations, you group them together in what's called a department, so that anyone who's a member of that department is more or less doing the same kind of things. The next slide after that one, approaches to departmentalization, give you some illustrations of this. Look at the figures, the images on the right-hand side of the slide, and you have, a marketing department, you have a department of customer service. So these are different ways of putting people into manageable categories, because in each of these departmental distinctions, you have a manager who kind of oversees the work by the people in that department. Number 3 is chain of command, and this is the line of authority. Again, using myself as an example at the Han, I'm one of the lecturers in this course, Essentials of Organization. I have to make sure that I communicate with the course owner, Yvette, and get from her permission to make some changes. If she says, no, let's not make that change, then I don't do it. And Yvette and I, through Yvette, we both are supervised by Yetcha. And she, in turn, is supervised by Arjan, the dean. So there's a chain of command that goes from me to Arjan. And in fact, when I first came to the Han in January, one of the first people I talked with was Arjan, because he's kind of at the top of my chain of command. He's the authority who ultimately I am responsible for pleasing, really. I have to make sure that he agrees with the kinds of things that I want to do and supports the decisions I've made. Next slide, there's actually 2 for chain of command, and the second of those 2 illustrates this with some images. Span of control, the number of people in one layer of the chain of command. And generally, you don't want to have more than about 10, 12 people that you control as a manager. Now, that's direct control. Span of control is about direct control. Because let's say you have a manager and there are 4 people who report to her, but each of those 4 people have 5 people reporting to him or her. Well, that's 20 people who are in some form or fashion supervised by that first manager. But really, that first manager's span of control is only those first 4 people that I was imagining. And again, there's a second slide to span of control that sort of illustrates this with some figures, some images. Next is centralization or decentralization. Centralization means that there is a person or a small team at the top of the organizational structure, the organizational hierarchy, top of the bureaucracy, who makes decisions that gets filtered down to everybody else through the different layers of management. And those ideas at the top that have to be carried out by people at the other levels of the organization, that would be a centralized organization, because decision-making is centralized or centered on the people at the top. And then the task is for them to give clear directions for what they want each of the managers below to make sure that people reporting to them perform. Decentralized means that decision-making authority is housed with people throughout the organization. That's quite true in many respects in the university I am associated with in North Carolina, UNC Wilmington, University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I'll give you a good example of how this doesn't work by comparing and contrasting something. Many years ago, I remember reading that the French education system, in primary education, I should say, was very centralized. In other words, there was a government organization, an agency, let's call it the French Education Agency, that dictated what had to be taught when in primary schools throughout France. And it was said at the time that, and I don't know if it's still true, but it was said at the time, and this is 20, 30, 40 years ago, that if you went into a classroom in Paris, let's say a classroom of 9-year-olds in Paris at 11 o'clock in the morning, and they would be teaching something, whatever it would be, you could go to a classroom in Lyon at 11 in the morning, a class of 9-year-olds, and the teacher would be teaching exactly the same thing. And that was true throughout all of France in primary schools. Again, I don't know if that was necessarily true, and if it was, I don't know if it's still true. But compare that with some experience I had for many years before I became, for a few years before, long before I became a professor. I taught elementary school for a few years, 3 years, in Los Angeles, California, USA. And so I taught 10 and 11-year-olds, and I was actually one of about 3, 4, or 5 teachers, it was a big school, who taught that age group. The term for that in America is 6th grade. I don't know if that term means anything to you if you're not a U.S. American. So I taught 6th grade. And the other 6th grade teachers, we all, taught the same people. We all had about 30 kids in our class. But at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, I might be teaching reading. Ms. Washington down the hall, she may have been teaching maths at 11 in the morning. At the exact same time, another teacher down the hall, also teaching 6th grade, maybe he was involved in free reading time, where the students were quietly reading whatever they wanted to read, as opposed to having a lesson about reading. So this illustrates a more decentralized approach. Now, in my work at the university, in most universities, there's a certain amount of decentralization when it comes to teaching decisions. So I can teach what I teach the way that I want to. It doesn't have to be identical to someone else's. But there's a great deal of centralization at the same time in the university about such things as when grades have to be turned in, when exams have to be given. Another example is there's a rule that says every teacher must have a specific attendance policy that is shared with the students, that is expressed to the students at the beginning of the semester. So a university, in the United States at least, is an interesting combination of decentralization and centralization. The next slide is called formalization. And formalization means the amount to which rules are developed and promoted and enforced. It also starts to address issues like communication style. For example, at the Han here, students address teachers by the first name, which I happen to like. In my university in North Carolina, it's actually quite rare for students to address their teachers by their first name. It's usually, most of my students call me Dr. Weber. My other colleagues who may not have doctorates, they're called Mr. or Ms. so-and-so. It's very rare for students to call us by our first name. And I don't mind either way. I mean, I'm fine either way, but it's just an interesting shift, interesting change to be called Dave or David, or by some nicknames that I've shared with you probably already. Webby. So some of my students in North Carolina call me Webby. And in Han, some of the students have called me Webby. But most of the students over there call me Dr. Weber. And again, that's indicating a certain kind of formalization that may not be true in every university. Boundary spanning. Boundary spanning is, well, if you have people who are in 2 different departmental areas, so you've got, let's say, an accountant, and you've got, say, a marketing specialist. Well, let's say the marketing specialist is really very effective at communicating with accountants. He knows, maybe, or she knows a little bit of the language, the technical language that accountants speak. Maybe this person took a few courses in the university, a few modules in the university about accounting. So he or she has actually learned a little bit about accounting. Not enough to be an accountant, but enough to talk the language, speak the language of accounting. Well, that person may be a boundary spanner. able to persuade some of those accountants to maybe make some different decisions that would maybe be to the benefit of the marketing specialists. But let's say that another marketing specialist, doesn't like accountants, doesn't care anything about accounting, doesn't want to have anything to do with accountants. If that person has to suddenly have a meeting with an accountant and has to maybe try to persuade that accountant to do something that the accountant may not want to do, well, that marketing person is not a very effective boundary spanner. So boundary spanning is an important communication skill that the people who are most effective in organizations are probably pretty good at. We have a couple of organizational frameworks to discuss. These are also called organizational structures. I'm trying to use that word structure to refer to more of the big picture of all of this rather than talk about organizational structures in the smaller sense, and I'm using the word organizational frameworks instead. So there's the simple framework. Again, the next slide starts on that. Limited departmentalization, wide spans of control. This would be simple framework would be typical, say, a shop in your neighborhood. Let's say there's a bicycle shop there. Well, you have Mary. She owns the shop, and maybe Mary has hired Jack to manage the shop, or maybe Mary manages the shop herself. But underneath Jack, there are, if he's the manager, there are, let's say, 10 employees. They work at different times. It's a pretty simple framework. The 10 employees report to Jack. Jack reports to Mary. If there is no Jack, if it's only Mary, they report to her. That's a simple framework. Functional framework and divisional framework, we kind of talk about these somewhat interchangeably. The functional framework emphasizes the different functions that the members provide, meaning the similarity of the tasks that they perform. And you can design an organization to kind of group people by that, or you can group people in a divisional framework. And that's more defined in terms of the kind of customers that you deal with, the geographic area that you serve. So that would be more the divisional framework. Not so much the actual role function that you perform. So I remember that years and years and years ago, about 10 years after I finished secondary school, I ran into a classmate of mine from secondary school named Bill. And Bill and I were talking about what he's doing, blah, blah, blah. And he was working for a very large, very bureaucratic organization called Carnation. I don't even know if they're in business anymore. Carnation Foods, a very big U.S. American food manufacturer. And he gave me his business card, and it said his name, and then it said Assistant Vice President, Mashed Potatoes Division, so back to Avico. And that was a divisional framework example in the sense that they grouped everybody who was involved in creating mashed potato products, selling mashed potatoes, keeping accounts of clients in mashed potatoes. All of them were in the mashed potatoes division. So less about the individual roles and more about the product area they were involved with. And then we have the matrix framework. Matrix framework is increasingly common, very popular, especially in organizations that have to really be able to move fast and change based on the organizational environment very fast. You wouldn't find matrix frameworks too commonly in heavy traditional bureaucratic organizations. But a matrix framework kind of puts people, if you can imagine a matrix, a table. And in a certain cell, you have the horizontal and you have the vertical. And it's kind of, let's say the horizontal is product and the vertical is functional. Well, right in that cell, that would be where you are. And that means that given your function and given the product that you're wanting to apply your function to, you're with a whole bunch of other people who also meet at that product and their function. You become a team, and it's, again, it's quite common. The downside is it's kind of confusing, and what's really interesting is what happens when you have a functional boss and a product boss telling you what to do. And they both have the same claim on you as someone who reports to them. Which one do you have to please? Which one do you have to listen to more? That gets confusing and it causes a great deal of stress. The next slide, organizational frameworks, just kind of illustrates this with some images. And we have also new organizational frameworks. We're going to talk about this just very briefly, just to kind of acquaint you with. We have what's called the virtual framework. It's also called network or modular framework, and I prefer those words. The word virtual, I like to kind of reserve that for all of the kinds of organizational activities that take place solely or primarily in an online environment, a remote or a distance environment. I just kind of reserve that word. But network or modular framework works. And in the network framework, you have a small core of people who run the company, if you will. Let's say it could be 5 people, 3 people. It's usually pretty small. And what they do is they outsource all of the functions. In other words, they hire other organizations who specialize in delivering certain kinds of functions. They hire them to do all of that work. So, for example, I might have a small group of people. I'll give you a good example. There's a coffee company in the United States, very small. It's founded by military veterans. It's called Black Powder Coffee. And it's actually a pretty small group of people. As I said, all of them are veterans. There's about 3 or 4 or 5 people. And, one of them's kind of, the head guy. And the other people kind of report to him, but it's more or less egalitarian. They're sort of equal to each other. Well, they hire someone to do their human resources. They hire a small organization that specializes in providing human resources services. They hire another organization that specializes in providing accounting services. So they hire these other organizations to kind of do these maintenance functions while this core of 5 or 6, 4 or 5 people kind of figures out who we're going to market to, who we want our customers to be, what kind of products we want to develop, and then they'll again hire someone else to help them develop the products. So that's a modular network. Team framework, somewhat similar in some respects, but the team framework means an organization that's built around teams. Very much associated with the matrix concept. So you'll have a team that takes on 2, 3, 4 projects at a given time. When one of those projects ends, another project is assigned to this team. There may be some change in the memberships of the teams, but that would be the team framework. And then we got the circular framework, which you're probably not going to run into that very often. But it starts with, again, that small group at the center of the organization. And this is a shared meaning kind of an organization if it's a circular framework. And they push out to rings around the center the shared meaning so that each of those rings does work that integrates the shared meaning into their work. And then they come up with the final product that is enhanced by this method. This is not common, and it's not something you really have to worry about, but we just mention it. Next slide is organizational strategies. And organizational strategies, we talked about that word before, strategy, and it basically means the big picture description of what's important to you to accomplish as an organization. And there's basically 3 that we can identify and play with. One is innovation, another is cost minimization, and the last is imitation. So a company that has an innovation strategy, what they really get very involved with is creating new products, creating new ways to sell the product. They're all about innovating. Let's skip to imitation. Imitation organizations, they will take ideas that other organizations have already innovated, and then they'll make changes to it. They'll ideally, from their point of view, tweak it, improve it. Let's take hamburgers. McDonald's is sort of considered the innovation organization in the world of fast food hamburgers, but now there are many. Well, many of them took their cues from McDonald's. And they would think about what McDonald's did well, and they would imitate it. They would think about what McDonald's didn't do so well, and they would kind of spin off their version of it. But basically, they were not about innovating in that sense. They were more about imitating. And then cost minimization, the fundamental driver of everything that happens in that organization is keep the costs as low as possible for the customers. Walmart might be a cost minimization strategy. If you don't know Walmart, it's a massive retailer in the United States, stores all over the place, and they are known for selling items as cheaply as they possibly can get away with selling them. And if you could, some Walmart stores, if you can find something they sell cheaper elsewhere in town, they will allow you to pay them the price you would get it elsewhere, just so that you would be their customer rather than someone else's customer. So that's lecture 2. Brought it in at just a hair over 30 minutes. I was hoping to bring it in just a hair under, but we've done it. So I'll see you, look forward to seeing you online pretty soon.